Today's video is brought to you by MyHeritage, the leading global service for family history research and DNA testing. More about that a bit later. Nestled into the North Caucasus Mountains, landlocked midway between the Black and Caspian Seas, lies a territory that most people either don't know at all or only know by its fearsome reputation: Chechnya. A semi-autonomous vassal state ruled with an iron fist, the Chechen Republic is today one of many republics arrayed under the Russian Federation, with President Vladimir Putin exerting his power and influence through his puppet dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov. Known at once for its beautiful highlands and the brutal and ongoing legacy of repression, organized crime, and human rights violations being perpetrated there, Chechnya occupies almost a mysterious air of darkness in Western consciousness. But for those who know Chechnya's road to where it is today, that darkness doesn't go away. Instead, it only becomes more bitter and more sorrowful for those familiar with the violence and warfare that have defined Chechnya since the end of the Cold War. It's one of those post-Soviet engagements that we're going to discuss today. The First Battle of Grozny, which lasted from December 1994 through March 1995. Waged over Chechnya's capital, this battle pitted Russian and Chechen fighters against each other in some of the most intense urban warfare that the world has ever seen. The First Chechen War kicked off on the 11th of December 1994, but in order to understand how the war came to be, we've got to go way back and understand that Chechen resistance to Russian occupation has a centuries-long history. With a mostly Muslim population and deep interconnections with other Islamic Caucasus territories like Dagestan and Ingushetia, Chechnya is one of many small Eastern European and Central Asian nations that would historically really prefer not living under Moscow's rule. Chechnya has been fighting back against Russian expansion since the late 1700s, with various resistances and independence movements over the following hundreds of years. This history has often been coupled with forced deportations, ethnic cleansing, and other efforts towards so-called Russification, attempts to forcibly integrate the Chechen population into Russia and homogenize it. But the prelude to the First Chechen War really gets going 3 years prior to its starting point, when in December 1991 the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia became an independent state. Although Russia was by far the biggest powerhouse to emerge out of the post-Soviet shuffle, the economic and military interdependence of the Soviet state meant that Russia's power and authority as an independent nation was difficult to quantify. Partly due to its sheer size, Russia has always been a multi-ethnic melting pot of a nation, although unlike similarly heterogeneous nations, Russia's cultural and ethnic divides are sharply geographical as well. Have you ever wondered where you come from, who your ancestors were, what they did? Well, I've been curious about my family history, and I partnered up with MyHeritage to find out more about my heritage. Clever name. MyHeritage is the leading global service for family history research and DNA testing. They've got 90 million users, and they make it easy and enjoyable to build your family tree and give you access to powerful tools to research your family history and grow that tree. It's as easy as adding a family member, add a photo if you want. I started with myself, added in my parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my siblings. Easy. And now, well, they say in the copy here that my tree has grown to 10 people. I spent some time in here, guys. It grew to I don't know how many are on there now, but I feel like it's got to be at least 100. Because when you get back I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 generations, they got like 9 siblings. That's 9 people just like that. They've all got crazy names that I've never heard of. And then there's one dude who's like, that's my great-great-grandpappy right there. Look, with more than 19 billion easily searchable historical records, you can find information about your ancestors in just a few clicks. I searched for my great-grandfather. I found a marriage certificate. It was from 1895? Is that right? It was like back in the day. It was all signed. And then there was a census record from around the same time, like detailing their household, that I'm sure was confidential at the time, but isn't anymore. MyHeritage has amazing other features too. They've got smart matches that can connect your family tree to someone else. Oh, this happened to me. Some woman even connected, I think she connected hers to mine, and then it just got even bigger because it was like, oh, okay, I see. And then and it became huge. They've also got powerful tools for preserving and enhancing your family photos. Look, I uploaded an old blurry black and white photo of my nan, which you're looking at right now, and they made it colorful and way better. They call it, what's it called? In color feature. That's right, it's amazing. So I loved what I discovered with MyHeritage, and you can too. Start building your family tree today, and you might find new relatives and records of your ancestors with very little effort. What are you waiting for? Sign up for a free 14-day trial and enjoy all of the amazing features of MyHeritage. And if you decide to continue your subscription, you get 50% off. Follow the link in the description below. Start exploring your family history now. Thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring. And now back to it. So, when the Soviet Union fell, Chechnya was one of a number of smaller ethnic minority regions that lobbied for independence, taking advantage not just of Russia's diminished power, but the political confusion and chaos at the moment. Russian President Boris Yeltsin had attempted to speed along the reintegration of these minority enclaves and passed a law in March of 1992 that would make autonomy concessions to each of them while bringing them back under the central authority of the Russian Federation. But unlike most of the enclaves, Chechnya was uninterested in giving up its chance at independence, and even the presence of high-level Chechen facilitators within the Yeltsin government weren't enough to convince Chechnya otherwise. By this time, Chechnya had already declared its own independence from the Russian state under a former Soviet Air Force general named Zakhar Dudayev. Dudayev had taken power in a coup in September of 1991, and he was confirmed via referendum a month later with broad popular support. Not only was Dudayev a fierce advocate of Chechen independence, but he was willing to back it up with action, and a November 1991 attempt by Yeltsin to take the capital city of Grozny by force saw his troops surrounded and forced to go home. After some initial struggles with their neighboring republic of Ingushetia, Chechnya formally declared full independence from Russia in 1993. This was by no means a peaceful process. Ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and Armenians within Chechnya were targeted violently and forced to flee, while pro- and anti-Dudayev factions fought for control of the new republic, often using heavy weapons. Dudayev responded to the unrest by dissolving the Chechen parliament, never a promising move, and after surviving multiple coup attempts, Dudayev was faced with a direct challenge from an alternative provisional government. This provisional government directly sought the support of Russia, and they got what they wanted in spades: financial backing, military hardware, and Russian mercenaries. However, they didn't guarantee Russia that they would hold off an independence movement. Far from it. Both sides made no bones about the fact that they would secure sovereignty eventually, just using different pathways and political structures to get there. The battle between Dudayev's government and the provisional forces grew more intense through 1994, with Russia sending air support for multiple attacks on the city of Grozny. But those attacks not only failed to oust Dudayev, but they created another problem. Many Russian troops on the ground, including not just civilian mercenaries, but regulars of the Russian army, were captured by Dudayev's forces. This was a major problem for Boris Yeltsin, but not so much in a hostage crisis way as more in a "this is getting pretty embarrassing" way. After issuing an ultimatum to all Chechen fighters to disarm and surrender, Yeltsin sent in the full might of the Russian military to lock down the region. On the 1st of December 1994, the heavy bomber runs began, and a few days later, Russian forces were inside Chechen borders. This was by no means a popular operation on the Russian side, with even prominent commanders within the invasion force resigning in protest to the mandate to fight enemies who Yeltsin simultaneously claimed as Russian citizens. The troops who did walk into Chechnya very quickly realized that they were entering a meat grinder. It's no secret that declaring total war on an entire nation usually encourages the various factions inside that nation to put their differences aside and fight a common enemy, but apparently Yeltsin himself must not have gotten the memo. Chechen resistance was immediate and fierce for the first several weeks of the fighting, with the Russian invasion force taking heavy losses. But with a territory as geographically small as Chechnya, Russian troops also didn't have to get particularly far in order to threaten the capital itself. On December the 29th, Russian forces seized an airfield near Grozny and then quickly dug in and fought off Chechen counterattacks. The entrenched position gave Russia a staging area to besiege the capital, a target that Chechnya had zero intention of losing. Deep in Chechen winter, the Battle of Grozny began. With the table set for battle, it's best to zoom in closely on each side and see precisely what sort of heat that they're packing prior to the battle getting underway. In aggregate numbers, the force differential between Russia and Chechnya was staggering. Russia had some 60,000 troops with which to besiege Grozny, as well as tanks, armored vehicles, air support, and short, easily maintained supply lines back to their own borders. By contrast, the Chechen side had between 1,000 men according to Chechnya and 12,000 according to Russia, with the best estimate falling somewhere in between 4,000 and 7,000. Under the best of circumstances, this would mean that the Chechens were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, or even closer to 15 to 1. Adding to the mess were 500,000 civilians, many of whom were unable to leave Grozny ahead of the battle. The Russian offensive took the shape of a fairly standard military operation under General Pavel Grachev, a Russian army commander and in the inner circle of senior Russian officers. In order to penetrate the city defenses, Russian troops intended to first conduct a campaign of air raids to soften their target, before then advancing on the ground in columns of armored vehicles. Initial expectations were that the advance into the city would be fairly quick and painless, despite the Chechen resistance in the countryside, due to a Russian assessment that their heavy armor and organization should be able to slice right through any small arms resistance that they would face. Grachev and his commanders were students of the Soviet strategic doctrine that urban terrain should either be avoided if it was defended, or it should be taken quickly with an overwhelming show of force if it was vulnerable. According to the Russian assessment of the situation, the militiamen in Grozny could not muster a true defense of the city. The Chechen defense had a lot to contend with, both in terms of their relative lack of powerful equipment and issues with organization. Nominally, Chechen forces were under the command of Colonel Aslan Marskadov, first deputy chairman of the State Defense Council. However, the reality was a lot more complicated than that, with individual warlords taking command of their own troops. In a more even battle space, this might have been an unmistakably good thing for Chechnya, with small unit commands more able to work in an urban combat environment than a heavily centralized force. But with Chechen fighters so badly outnumbered, there was a real chance that this kind of disorder could spell their doom. A smaller contingent of foreign nationals, many of them Ukrainian, also complicated matters despite their addition of badly needed manpower. On the bright side, many fighters were former Soviet troops with an intimate knowledge of the decisions their adversaries would make on the battlefield. Many other militia members had fighting experience from other fronts like Azerbaijan or Turkey. The Chechen compromise was to split into squads of some 20 fighters, further subdivided into teams of 3 or 4 people, all of whom were responsible for taking over their own small part of a broadly coordinated defense of the city. Chechen units were only lightly equipped with rifles, sniper rifles, and machine guns, but they did have rocket-propelled grenades to add into the mix. They also had a small handful of Soviet-era tanks, not enough to face the Russians in head-to-head combat, but enough to cause problems if used correctly. While a few Chechens manned the tanks, the rest would form fire teams. One man with an RPG, one with a light machine gun, one with a sniper rifle, and one with an assault rifle. Obviously, there was some mixing and matching with various combat needs, but you get the idea. It was these small units who would have to think creatively, use the urban environment to their advantage, and do whatever was necessary to slow down or stop the Russian advance. After a week of indiscriminate air raids that caused the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of Chechen civilians, the Russian military felt that they had pounded the piss out of Grozny for long enough to move in. On New Year's Eve 1994, the 1st Battalion of the 131st Maikop Brigade was tasked with entering the city. The battalion included some 1,000 troops, backed up by 26 tanks and 120 armored vehicles, all moving in a column toward the city center. 3 auxiliary forces would advance from other angles and meet the Maikop Brigade at the presidential palace. According to General Grachev, it was to be a bloodless blitzkrieg in which the Russians would easily sweep aside the scattered militia that they expected to find inside. What Grachev either chose to overlook or didn't understand was that his troops were not prepared to engage in urban combat, and they lacked any meaningful training in how to do so. Like the United States and other powerful militaries, Russian doctrine stresses that cities and other urban warfare zones are better avoided or circumvented than taken head-on. So not only did the Russian troops not know what they were going to do once they got into a city, but they didn't even know how to keep themselves safe. As it turns out, the Chechen tactic of 4 poorly armed dudes against the world actually worked extremely well, with their fighters able to hammer the advancing column with everything they had, from odd angles and using urban cover, and then melt away before the Russians could even respond. Unaware of what they would face, Russian troops marched in parade formations, with their soldiers and vehicles tightly packed in on narrow streets that wouldn't allow them to maneuver or retreat. In the words of Ilyas Akhmadov, a Chechen fighter and future foreign minister, our tactics were simple but effective. We let the Russian columns enter the city, driving along streets where the armored personnel carriers and tanks could not maneuver. When a column was engaged in a narrow avenue, we simply shot the leading troop transport and the last one of the column. The Russians were sitting ducks. The Maikop Brigade and a handful of smaller ingress forces marched straight into an ambush, welcomed by a pre-recorded radio message waiting for them at the Grozny train station. Welcome to hell. The Chechen forces gave no quarter once the Russians were pinned down, using every weapon available to them while sitting safely on rooftops and high stories of buildings, too high for Russian heavy guns to reach, and out of view for the Russians to even see. The invading soldiers, many of them untrained conscripts, were mowed down. Those who were able to flee into the adjoining buildings were hunted, trapped, and captured or put to death. A Russian leadership had no plan to deal with this. After all, they hadn't even considered that they might face organized or large-scale resistance within Grozny, and certainly not with an enemy that could create such an elaborate trap. A Russian radio blackout didn't help matters, as units that hadn't yet been hit had no idea that their comrades were under attack. Troops that radioed for support or for artillery cover received nothing. After all, there was no second wave of Russian troops with any level of readiness to enter the city and no artillery to help. In some instances, Russian forces were led into friendly fire engagements where they fought for hours, spilling each other's blood while the Chechens watched. In others, panicked Russian troops needed no Chechen assistance in losing their composure and attacking anything that moved, including their own comrades in arms. Some Chechen snipers took to intentionally wounding the enemy rather than killing them in order to pick off any soldiers that came to aid a wounded man. Other resistance forces would disguise themselves as civilians and offer to guide Russian troops within the city, instead leading them into traps. Any attempts from each unit within the city to help one another would see them led into more ambushes by an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The fighting dragged on for days. But at no point was this a battle in which Russian troops tried to accomplish any tactical objectives or even launched a reasonable level of counterattack. Instead, this was a desperate bid for survival. The Maikop Brigade, which again comprised over 1,000 men, was wiped out completely within 2.5 days. Hundreds more troops were killed, along with the loss of 26 tanks and 102 armored vehicles. And how did General Grachev help all of this? Well, he proclaimed victory and declared back to Moscow that Grozny was under Russian control. The effects of this mess were devastating on Russian forces, especially as rescue operations, slow to get going, were ambushed in turn. Captured Russian troops were shown on television, with many of their mothers traveling personally to Grozny to try and negotiate their release, and even Russian Special Forces troops were unable to navigate the cityscape long enough to escape detection. According to one Chechen leader, over 400 Russian tanks and armored transports were destroyed in all. Morale, as you can expect, was in the toilet, and many Russian commanders paid for such a catastrophic failure with their jobs. Unfortunately for Chechnya, though, they were still badly outnumbered, and they couldn't hold off Russian advances forever. In the first few days of January, Chechen forces began to retreat out of Grozny, abandoning some parts of the meat grinder that they'd set up. They had done an admirable job of holding the city, but remember, we're dealing with a couple of thousand defenders at most, and even if their losses in the early battle were a fraction of Russia's, they were still too many to willfully accept. Some Chechen forces remained behind to defend the city, but others did their best to get the remaining heavy combat vehicles out in one piece. Unfortunately, many of those pieces would be destroyed by Russian airstrikes. And as idiotic as the initial Russian advance might have been, the remaining troops in charge of taking Grozny had enough survival instinct not to just jump straight back into the wood chipper. Instead, they leveraged their heavy artillery and their tanks in a much wiser way, proceeding through the city block by block in a starkly destructive rhythm. Level a city block, infiltrate the rubble with special forces and snipers, and kill anyone that remains. Wash, rinse, repeat. The Russians also used white phosphorus rounds and vacuum bombs, tremendously destructive and indiscriminate weapons that the Chechen resistance had no ability to stop. The Chechen resistance within the city centered around the presidential palace, defended by about 500 fighters and militiamen. After weeks of fighting and heavy bombardment of the palace, those resistance fighters began to be isolated. Supplies and ammunition dropped low, and Russian tanks were able to come closer and closer, sometimes firing at point-blank range against the palace. On January the 18th, Russia decided it had had enough. The palace came under relentless assault from rockets, heavy artillery, and aerial bombing in a constant barrage. But even after this, many Chechens inside were able to survive. They would make their escape at night, with many of them getting out of the city or otherwise making it to safety. With the palace given up, the Chechens continued their resistance at long range, moving into a sniper-based defense and sabotaging infrastructure before it fell into Russian hands. For another month, the remaining resistance within the city defended a smaller and smaller area, drawing down their forces in a progressive tactical retreat that still looked a hell of a lot better than any of what Russia had done in their initial offensive. On February 22nd, the last Chechen fighters sacrificed a trio of tanks and abandoned their headquarters, moving into the foothills around Grozny and preparing for an asymmetrical guerrilla defense. After weeks and weeks of grueling battle, Grozny had fallen, its buildings leveled, and its streets awash in Russian blood. It's difficult to pin down an exact number of casualties from the Battle of Grozny on either side. According to Russia, some 1,400 troops were killed in battle, with another 400 missing, but this is almost certainly an undercount. Thousands more were wounded and hundreds of heavy vehicles were lost in the fighting. On the Chechen side, it's impossible to say how many fighters might have been killed, but that number almost definitely ran into the hundreds and probably the thousands. What we do know is the terrible civilian cost of the offensive: some 27,000 citizens of Grozny and the surrounding area. Whether some might have died fighting alongside the militia, we don't know. But we do know that the 5,000 children killed were not there to fight. The battle was condemned internationally, not just for Russia's aggression against its own people, but for the thousands of avoidable civilian casualties that came as a result of the engagement. Within Russia, the battle disillusioned many soldiers and officers, including highly ranked military generals and commanders. In Chechnya, the defense of Grozny would lead to a continued fierce resistance against Russian occupation, one that would force a ceasefire in 1996. Grozny would be fought over twice more in the coming years, in 1996 and 1999. When exploring the tactics and strategies employed by both sides, we can't emphasize enough the importance of the Chechens' use of urban warfare tactics as a force equalizer. What the Chechens clearly lacked in numbers, they more than made up for in their knowledge of the city, their ability to move freely and coordinate between small units, and their ability not to use equally powerful weapons, but the right weapons to stand up to Russia's advance. Quite frankly, Russian leaders did not have a respectable understanding of what they were headed into, and they were completely unprepared for the reality of urban combat. Their troop carriers and tanks became death traps set inside of a larger ambush, set inside of a city that was a trap in itself. To make matters worse, the Chechens very quickly figured out how unprepared the Russians were, and they used that naivete to their own advantage. On many occasions, Chechen fighters let the Russians come forward, believing they were unopposed or pretending to retreat in order to lure their columns into an ideal location for an ambush. In other cases, they would set up friendly fire incidents or lead columns into narrow streets and alleys that were so tightly packed that destroying the right couple of vehicles would trap the entire column. And much like the modern-day example of resistance troops in Ukraine, the Chechens showed a willingness to play with their food when it suited the moment. But no level of Chechen creativity, no level of all-out resistance could have gone quite so well against such overwhelming odds unless Russian forces had demonstrated critical failures as well. On this front, there was no shortage of factors to consider, from the use of untrained conscripts to the lack of unit training and preparation prior to the battle to a lack of appropriate weaponry and equipment for the situation they faced. The planning of Russian generals was needlessly optimistic, uninformed by even the most basic intelligence gathering, and with zero contingency plans or readiness for a rescue mission in case things went inconceivably sideways. Their understanding of what would break the will of the Chechen resistance, a quick campaign of aerial bombing, wasn't just incorrect, but quite possibly it was complete guesswork. As we've seen both before and since, Russia badly overestimated its ability to use the threat of force to coerce a surrender, and failed to recognize that it was dealing with an enemy fighting not over some difference of opinion, but for survival. The entire Russian march into Grozny was predicated on a faulty assumption that Chechens gave a shit that Russia was marching into Grozny, and given the extent to which Russian failures have been repeated since this battle, it appears the nation's generals have yet to learn their lesson. Although Chechen forces did ultimately have to cede Grozny to the Russian invasion, the battle was just one step in a brutal war of attrition, one that was fought to convince Moscow that despite its appetite for control, Chechnya wouldn't be worth the pain of trying to conquer it. From a cataclysmic first week of defense, to a focused and disciplined tactical retreat, to a concession of the city that ultimately took place on Chechen terms, the defense of Grozny was precisely what Chechen forces needed in order to keep their sovereignty, not forever, but for one more day, and one more day after that. Survive enough days, bleed the occupier for long enough, and one of those days the occupier is bound to lose its taste for war.